If the United States wants to contain China through technological means, which is understandable, then I think they're pursuing very mistaken tactics. I don't understand why. By cutting off semiconductor, for instance, when Mr. Biden did, and the Chinese were asleep at the wheel for a long time on the stuff, they woke up the Chinese who said, whoa, this is what they could do to us. And listen, we graduate more STEM students than the rest of the world combined. Okay, and we got research dollars more than the rest of the world combined. If you don't think we can lick semiconductor, you gotta be out to lunch.
大家好，今天这期节目我想先给大家还原一个神仙打架的一个现场。左边这位是82岁的约翰·米尔斯海默，美国现实主义国际关系学派的一个扛把子，写了大国政治的悲剧，一辈子就研究一件事：大国之间怎么互相掐架。右边是李世默，中国学者、企业家，跑过全世界，见过真刀真枪的商业战场。米尔斯海默一本正经地分析美国要用技术手段遏制中国，切断半导体供应。李世默直接打断他，他说：“我们理工科毕业生比全世界加起来还多，研发经费也不少。你觉得我们真的搞不定芯片？我认为是你脑子进水了。”全场哄堂大笑，这场面非常精彩。一个活在冷战剧本里，一个活在21世纪的现实里。今天我们完整的去复盘这场世纪辩论，看看美国到底能不能用技术手段去遏制中国，而中国是否真的怕芯片封锁，以及未来的格局将会是怎样。首先我们先看一下米尔斯海默和李世默之间的这个精彩的辩论。
globalization nowadays.
I think the most important event in recent years was when we transitioned from unipolarity to multipolarity. I think when one wants to assess international relations, the first question you want to ask yourself is, what does the structure of the international system look like? I was born in 1947 during the Cold War, and we lived until 1989 in a bipolar world. There were two great powers on the planet, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War ended, and then we moved into a unipolar world. And I would imagine most people in the audience came of age during the unipolar moment, when there was only one great power in the system, and that was the United States of America. That world went away in roughly 2017, and we now live in a world where there are three great powers. The structure of the system has an enormous influence on how states interact with each other, and it has an enormous impact on globalization. During the Cold War, when I was young, there was really no globalization, in large part because there were two different worlds, the communist world and the Western world. And people in Hungary lived in a communist order or a Soviet-led order. Hungary belonged to the Warsaw Pact. It didn't belong to NATO. What then happened is the Cold War ended in 1989, and you had a unipole. And once you have a unipole, you get globalization, because the United States runs around the world running things. It creates a global economic order. It brings countries like Russia and Hungary, Russia for a while, Hungary up until this present day, into this globalized order. But what's happened is we've left unipolarity and we moved into multipolarity. And what you see happening is that globalization, that global order, that liberal international order that existed during unipolarity has fallen apart. And what you're getting is a new order. You're seeing a country like China trying to influence the order by building its own institutions, by shaping how states interact with each other through organizations like BRICS and the Belt and Road Initiative. So what I would say is that moving forward, you're not going to see anything like that globalization that you saw during the unipolar moment, in large part because the foundation has changed. We've gone from unipolarity to multipolarity.
I think the last round of globalization, which has been about 30 years, maybe 40 years, had, of course, generated tremendous amount of economic prosperity and wealth, and China certainly was one of the largest beneficiaries of this globalization, and so has the United States been. Both of our countries' GDP went up significantly. China went up a lot more because we began at a lower base. But the problem with globalization as it stands is, I think, it cannot go on for two reasons. One is, I think, within the United States and the West, somehow the economic benefits derived from globalization weren't distributed in a way that satisfied multiple segments of its population. So it's led to an internal revolt against globalization. So the architect of this first round of globalization is having internal resistance to it. So that's, of course, leading to deglobalization, because the leader of the globalization was saying, we don't want to do this anymore. And the second issue is, of course, the largest developing country that participated in globalization was China. And in the beginning, I think they had designed it in a way that the US and Western countries were at the core of globalization, and there were countries, developing countries, at the periphery. And the division of labor was clear. You know, the US and Western Europe were going to be in charge of R&D and finance and military, and we're going to do cheap labor and sell natural resources if we had them. China didn't have them, but others had them, and provide market. But of course, as China grew, it said, no, we didn't agree to that. We're going to move up the value chain. And unfortunately, the US and certain Western countries, they thought this, perceived that as a threat. So they didn't want to do that anymore. So I think we're in, globalization is in trouble. But let me also comment on the liberal international order. I'm not sure where that came from. Certainly when China signed up to the WTO, it wasn't told it was signing up to the liberal international order. It wasn't such thing. I mean, I think it was made up in retrospect. I mean, I think when President Jiang went to Washington, when China was trying to enter the WTO, President Bill Clinton didn't say, hey, President Jiang, you're signing up to the liberal international order. It didn't happen. So it was never there. So that's my 2 cents.
Eric made the point that both China and the United States got much richer during the unipolar moment when we had globalization. And he's, of course, correct. And the United States didn't care about that because the United States thought that once China got really rich and it got embedded in international institutions, it would become a responsible stakeholder, to use Robert Zoellick's term, and then it would become a democracy, and once it was a democracy, we'd all live happily ever after. This would be the end of history. That was the basic idea. But it didn't turn out that way because once China got really powerful economically, it translated that economic might into military might, and it began to throw its muscle around. And this, of course, scared the living bejesus out of the Americans, and the Americans have moved to counter China. We now care about relative gains. See, Eric was talking about absolute gains where we're both getting rich. And we didn't care about relative gains then. But now that China's a great power, we care about relative gains. So what we want to do is we want to maximize American growth, and we want to minimize Chinese growth. Anything we can do to slow down the Chinese economy and refurbish the American economy, we will do. And you see this reflected in the competition over cutting-edge technologies. We're extremely scared that China is going to beat us in terms of developing cutting-edge technologies. Now, where do tariffs come in? Tariffs are part of the story. What we're trying to do with tariffs is modernize, refurbish the American industrial base, make us much more competitive, and we're trying to weaken China at the same time. Because again, we care about relative power. And all of this is to say that I agree with you, Liz, that we made a fundamental mistake in the 1990s and in the first 20 years of the 21st century in helping China to become Godzilla. It's come back to haunt us, and we're now trying to rectify that. And again, tariffs are part of that story.
Let me comment on that.
Let Eric comment on this.
I think well, of course, like I said, both countries benefit tremendously. But if the United States, certainly the U.S. did not set up the system and ask China to join out of charity. I really don't think so. They thought that they would benefit too. That's number one. Number two, if the U.S. thought that if China develops and eventually it will become a liberal country, they never told us that. Nobody told us that. It was a secret intent. It wasn't disclosed in the prospectus. Okay, we signed up to WTO, and there was a prospectus. There were a bunch of rules, a lot of text, a lot of words, nothing in it that said, hey, if your economy develops, you must become a liberal society. It wasn't there. We didn't sign up to that, like I said. So I think, well, look, if the U.S. is now changing its path, changing its direction, that's completely within its power to do. It's a sovereign nation. Tariffs and all of that, if the globalization, if the United States wants to ditch globalization for its own needs, I think China will adapt. Everybody has to adapt. It's okay. I think China will do okay in this new era, and it will adapt.
John.
Yeah, if I can just say a word, picking up on what you said. I think the way to think about the world we're moving into is to separate the economic from the security competition, and think about it in the context of the pre-World War I period, not the Cold War. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, what is he talking about? Before World War I, here in Europe, there was a huge amount of economic intercourse among all of the states. There was a huge amount of economic interdependence here in Europe. Nevertheless, at the same time, you had two powerful security blocs. One was the Triple Entente, which was France, Britain, and Russia, and the other was the Triple Alliance. Germany, of course, was the key player, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And you had this intense security competition before World War I that, of course, in August 1914, led to World War I. But at the same time you had this intense security competition, you had all this economic interdependence. Fast forward to the Cold War, when I grew up, there was hardly any economic intercourse between the West and the East. So there was security competition, but no economic intercourse. The situation moving forward is going to look like the pre-World War I period. It's not going to look like the Cold War. There's going to be a great deal of economic intercourse between India and China, the United States and China, Europe and China. The key issue inside the economic realm will have to do with high edge or cutting edge technologies. That's what the United States really cares about in terms of the competition with China. And just to take Europe and how this competition will affect Europe, there's no question, given the economic state of Europe, that European states will have a powerful incentive to want to trade with China. And the United States will tolerate that as long as Europeans don't trade cutting-edge technologies to the Chinese. Because what the Americans are trying to do, as Eric knows very well, is the Americans are trying to throttle, slow down China's development of cutting-edge technologies. And the United States is not going to be happy if Europe trades cutting-edge technologies or technologies that feed into cutting-edge technologies with China. But nevertheless, Europeans, Americans, Indians, we're going to trade with the Chinese. But at the same time, you're going to have a wicked and very dangerous security competition in East Asia for many, many years moving forward.
Eric?
I think if the United States wants to contain China through technological means, which is understandable, then I think they're pursuing very mistaken tactics. I don't understand why. Because by cutting off semiconductor, for instance, when Mr. Biden did, and the Chinese were asleep at the wheel for a long time on the stuff, they woke up the Chinese and said, whoa, this is what they could do to us. And listen, we graduate more STEM students than the rest of the world combined. Okay, and we got research dollars more than the rest of the world combined. If you don't think we can lick semiconductor, you gotta be out to lunch. So I just don't think that's the productive way to go about it. And by the way, I totally understand. I think the Chinese understand the U.S. wants to reindustrialize. If I were running the United States, I would want to reindustrialize too. I just wish there could be a friendlier way to go about it externally. And I actually think, that's why I'm actually reasonably optimistic. I actually think the Chinese would be willing to cooperate and maybe contribute to that effort. Certainly China is the largest industrial power in the world. There's some kind of accommodation that could be reached, I believe, if we pursue a friendlier atmosphere.
视频看完之后，我们一起来做一个总结。首先，我们来说一下米尔斯海默的一个逻辑。他是一个非常诚实的战略家，他也不掩饰美国的意图。他主要说了3条：第一是美国帮助中国崛起是为了改变中国。美国以为让中国变富，嵌入国际体系，中国就会成为负责任的利益相关者，变成民主国家，历史终结。结果没做成。第二，现在美国关心的是相对收益，不是绝对收益。什么叫做绝对收益？咱俩都赚钱，我不在乎你赚多少。什么叫相对收益啊？就是你赚的比我多，我就亏了。冷战之后呢，30年，美国不在乎中国赚多少。现在我们要最大化美国增长，最小化中国增长。任何能拖慢中国经济、振兴美国经济的事，都是美国现在必须要做的。第三就是未来格局要像1战前的欧洲。米尔斯海默说，冷战时期东西方几乎没有经济往来，但未来不一样，经济上大家还互相依赖，可安全上分成2个阵营。就像1941年之前的欧洲，经济上紧密交织，安全上剑拔弩张。用一句话来总结米尔斯海默，帮中国崛起是美国最大的战略失误，现在我们要纠正它。随后李世默进行了反击，我们来看一下李世默是怎么进行回应的。他没有去讲大道理，他讲了2件事情。第一，美国当初搞全球化不是因为好心，是因为有利可图。美国也不是出于慈善让中国加入 WTO， 是因为美国自己觉得有好处。 当时没有人告诉我们，你要签一个自由主义国际秩序的合同，从来没有，那都是后来编出来的。他说这话什么意思？就是你别装无辜，当初你们主导全球化，是因为你们觉得你们是核心，我们是外围，分工也很清楚。你们搞研发、金融、搞军事，我们搞廉价劳动力、卖资源、卖市场。但中国长大了之后说，不行，我们没同意，永远在最底层，我们要往上走。美国这时候说你就是威胁，这显然是不合理的。第二，你用芯片卡我，结果就是把中国人打醒了。这是李世默非常犀利的一段话。他说，当初拜登搞半导体封锁的时候，中国确实被打了个措手不及。但你想过没有，我们每年毕业的理工科学生比全世界加起来很多，我们的研发经费在全世界也排到第二。你居然觉得我们搞不定芯片，你到底在想什么？然后他补充了一句更狠的，我不否认美国想再工业化，如果我是美国总统，我也想再工业化，但问题是你能不能找个友好的方式。这段话的潜台词就是你卡我脖子，不仅卡不住，还会逼出一个比你更强的对手。说到这，很多人可能会觉得这不就是中国必胜那套话术吗？但大家去仔细想一下，李世默真正的杀招不是喊口号，这是结构性的自信。他不是在说我们马上就能超过美国，他是在说你封锁我，反而逼我加速自主，你搞遏制，反而让我彻底摸清你的底牌，你搞脱钩，反而让全世界看到中国的工业能力有多硬。他说了一句特别重要的话，中国愿意以友好的方式帮助美国在工业化，中国现在是全球最大的工业国，肯定能找到某种合作的方式。这话说的太漂亮了，但他不是示弱，也不是硬刚，他是说我有能力，我也愿意合作，但你别拿枪指着我。米尔斯海默说我们要遏制中国，李世默说你可以试试，但结果可能跟你想象的不一样。最后想用一句话来结束今天这期节目，遏制不是答案，唤醒才是最大的风险。米尔斯海默用他那一套大国政治悲剧的剧本分析了半天，最后得出的结论是我们做错了一件事，帮中国变成了哥斯拉。但他没意识到的是，中国不是哥斯拉，哥斯拉是科幻片里的怪物，中国是14亿人，是470万理工科毕业生，是全球最完整的工业体系，是被封锁之后反而跑得更快的那个选手。米尔斯海默还在写剧本，李世默已经跳出剧本。所以这场辩论的真正价值不在于谁赢了，而在于它让我们看清楚一件事情，有些人还在用冷战的思维看世界，但是世界已经变了。中国不需要战胜美国，中国只需要做自己，做好自己的事，处理好自己的问题，剩下的时间会给出答案。好了，本期节目就到这里，感谢大家收看。